Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast, where we explore natural homeschooling, gentle parenting, simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Family Mentor, coming to you from an island in the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my hilarious husband and 3 growing sailors in our fixer-upper on the beach. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. This is episode 89, and today I'm here with Gina Riley talking about unschooling outcomes. Gina is an educational psychologist, clinical professor, and program leader of adolescent special education programs at CUNY-Hunter College, and she is known internationally for her work in the fields of intrinsic motivation, homeschooling, unschooling, and self-directed learning. I mentioned in this episode that just a few days ago was Sky's graduation. In honor of her graduating with her associate degree and high school diploma and being accepted at her university of choice, I just updated the Unschooling to College post with a lot more details about how she got there, which I will link to in the show notes. If you would like a little soft structure to help set your child and family up for success with unschooling, take the Bucket System course. Stephanie says, I had children coming to me this morning begging to take their vitamins, teeth brushed, and beds made before 9 a.m. this morning, smiling and giggling as they plopped their pins into their buckets. While I know the novelty will wear off, as I know we're only just beginning, the course addresses this too. I have more confidence for a game plan and feel like we finally found the soft structure I've been pining for. The why behind the bucket system, collaboration as a family, and emphasis on trust, respect, boundaries, and autonomy is simply amazing. Being a family who has individuals with neurodivergence, including myself, the bucket system meets so many needs. Thank you for leaving that review, Stephanie. And if you want to foster intrinsic motivation in your kids too, head to sagefamily.com/bucket-system. Welcome to the show, Gina. Will you introduce yourself and share a bit about who you are and what you're passionate about?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me on. It's such a thrill. My name is Dr. Gina Riley. I am the program director and a clinical professor at CUNY-Hunter College. My program specializes in adolescent special education. So for most of my life, I teach teachers and New York City public school teachers. I study homeschooling and unschooling and democratic schooling, intrinsic motivation in education. I am the mother of an adult person who is unschooled all of their lives. So the first day of school was their first day of college. And now my son is 27 years old. So it's so funny saying that, right? Like you're a parent forever, but you're a parent of an adult. And I've been in this field for a long time.
Well, for those of you who don't know Gina, she has been in my orbit. I was telling her for years, and I have been sending people to her resources and citing her research. And so she's a real gift to the education period in general, because like she said, she works to teach teachers and she is professionally so steeped in, sort of the more mainstream educational models. And at the same time, she was raising and unschooling her own child. So much wisdom, so much experience that we're going to tap into from you today, Gina. Let's start with some advantages. So what are the advantages of unschooling according to grown unschoolers? What is the research telling us?
Yeah. So, the research with grown unschoolers as well as unschooling families really is the same, right? Unschoolers tend to love the family freedom, the freedom of time and schedule. But the thing we most see is the thing that we most study, which is the increase in intrinsic motivation just all over the place. That focus on strengths and interests, that increase like doing what you love and being able to do what you're passionate about for the majority of your day.
Yes, that's so true. I asked one of my own kids, like, what do you think is the biggest advantage? It was the biggest advantage of growing up unschooled. And he said it was that he could go at his own pace.
Yeah.
So like that's something that, he saw in some of his schooled peers that created a lot of unnecessary stress and pressure and anxiety and, identity things. And he really got to exist outside of all that and just like, hey, you can't do that yet. Like, if that's something that's meaningful to you, let's work on it. And just this notion, we never had this notion that like he wasn't enough and that like whenever you get there is the perfect exact right time for you to get there. So his feedback was being able to go at his own pace.
I love that. I mean, that's something that you hear more recently in terms of benefits all over the place. So you hear about that freedom of time and space, freedom to eat when you want to, sleep when you want to, bodily autonomy, right? So not only like interest-based, but also just freedom across the board and autonomy. And that seems to be really, really important.
So that particular child actually decided to try high school this last school year. He was a freshman. And that was like one of his big things that like now, even at the end of the year, he still can't quite wrap his head around that. Like, if I have to pee, like, I'm just going to pee. Like, you can't tell me, no, I can't pee. I don't understand how you guys think this works. Like, that's not how bodies work.
I love that. Yes, yes. And if I'm hungry or if I'm thirsty, right, it's the same.
Yeah, like I'm tired. So I'm going to sleep today. And
yeah. It's like something we need to learn as adults, right? Like we have to remind ourselves to hydrate. And sometimes we have to remind ourselves to eat healthily and things like that. And I think it just comes so naturally to kids who have been unschooled.
Yeah.
And there's
this like knowing through and through that like my health, I know what I need in this moment and I give myself permission to meet it. And these other things that are like enriching to me and that give me advantages, like I'm absolutely tapping into those and honoring those and nurturing those, but like I'm clear on the hierarchy. And that's so cool because like you said, so many of us adults, like I'm still working on that.
Yeah, I'm sitting here reminding myself to hydrate, right? And it's so interesting, right? Because schools are putting a lot of extra resources and a lot of extra focus on social emotional learning. And I feel like if, we were to do other studies of unschoolers and homeschoolers, you would see that is very, very well developed kids who are unschooled and homeschooled. And that's really important.
Yeah. Okay. One of the things you mentioned in there was motivation, lots of intrinsic motivation. And I know lots of people want to know, how do we support that, right? How do we facilitate intrinsic motivation in our kids? And I know this is a particular passion for you. So can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So most of my work, pretty much all of my life, I wrote my master's thesis on this, my doctoral dissertation years and years ago, and have been studying it my entire life. I tend to study intrinsic motivation as defined by Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, who are the founders of self-determination theory. And I'm so excited. I got to meet them at a conference 2 weeks ago. It was like the best day of my whole life, right? And so when I think about defining intrinsic motivation, it comes from their theory and it's about passion and joy and curiosity and really loving every day. It's like the best ever Saturday every single day. And everyone always asks, okay, well, you can't force intrinsic motivation because that would be extrinsic. So how could you facilitate it? And Deci and Ryan gives us the answer, right? And they give us the answer through a theory or a sub-theory with a fancy name called cognitive evaluation theory. But it really provides 3 basic tenets, environmental tenets that support us as parents or as teachers, right? To facilitate intrinsic motivation in our kids. And the 3 things are really simple. We can take them apart however way you want to take them apart. But it's really instilling and facilitating a sense of competence in our kids, and then facilitating a sense of autonomy or choice and freedom in our kids. And then, of course, facilitating a sense of relatedness or the feeling that someone loves and has your back no matter what. There are three simple things, but when you take it in a practical sense and you try to utilize this, right, it's hard because real life is hard. So we could take these apart if you want, or however you want to talk about
Yeah, I think that all of these things seem so perfectly suited to like self-directed education, because it's like, what things do you care about and are you good at? And let's go all in on those together. Like,
yeah, that's exactly what it is, right? With like a sense of freedom and autonomy. And really, like when you take it apart, right, your competence is about just really like kids knowing their own strengths and interests, and being acknowledged for those strengths and interests. So again, like it's not like the parents saying that these are your strengths and interests. It's really the student saying like, okay, here I am, and here's my strengths. I know what I'm good at. I know what I'm interested in, and I'm going forth with that. And so that competence factor is important. And with the autonomy, it's all about freedom and choice. And if you think about like all of the other types of education, I tend to be a person that says, unschooling is just a spectrum, right? It's just part of the spectrum of all of the other choices in education that you can make. It is unschooling where you find the most freedom and the most autonomy and the most sense of choice.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's that relatedness factor that unschooling parents and guardians and grandparents and whoever is unschooling kids are so good at. And that's really I love you no matter what. I accept you no matter whether you succeed or fail, whether you do like exactly what you're supposed to do or whether you've made a mistake, and I'm here and I have your back. And that's really important. It's harder to apply, right? Because we love when kids are like compliant and do what we want and all of that. Unconditional acceptance is really hard, but it's probably the most important. It's the most important to have someone have your back no matter what choice you make.
Yeah. And I like the question, like, how can I help, really helps me sometimes to calibrate that, calibrate that space between like freedom and letting them own their own stuff and that relatedness, like supportive relatedness of how can I help? It's like, go do something else.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's like, it's so funny because I'm studying now. So what has come up again and again when I do research on like democratic schools or free schools or unschooling is this concept like of how autonomy support, which is also a DC and Ryan phrase, is so important, right? Sometimes the best way we can help is to be supportive of our kids' autonomy, and to really just let them go and do and let them make the mistakes they have to make and also assess what they have to do themselves without us assessing for them.
Yes. I think something too that like can help some adults like wrap their head around this is that I also see this theory applied like to in careers, like in workplaces, like how do employees, workers, whatever, like perform at their best? Like these are the three ingredients that they see.
Yeah, I mean, this theory, the amazing thing about self-determination theory is it's used in every discipline. So you see it in the workplace, you see it in education, you see it in healthcare, you see it in like environmental science. It is really an incredible theory and very, very powerful as we're talking about homeschooling and unschooling.
Yeah. Okay, so those are like some advantages. Now let's talk about some of the disadvantages. What are some of the disadvantages of unschooling according to some of the grown unschoolers that you've reviewed?
Sure. So one of the greatest disadvantages that we have seen both in the grown unschoolers and in the unschooling families is that the hardest part about unschooling is criticism from the outside world. It's from neighbors or their own families or an outside world or community that doesn't really understand unschooling. And that criticism has long-lasting effects, right? It doesn't just affect you as a child. It affects you as an adult when you're looking past on your educational experience. So criticism is one of the top challenges in dealing with that criticism in a productive, healthy way. We we've also seen challenges such as learning gaps. People mention this sometimes, and everyone just gets scared and says, oh my gosh, right? Like that's definitely a disadvantage. But I'm always like, people in school report learning gaps as well, right?
I have many.
I have many as well. And so this is not just an unschooling or homeschooling issue. This is just, we have gaps in learning, right? We tend to study what we're interested in. We tend to maybe not focus or be less interested in the things that we are not. And I think that's sort of just this natural, normal part of life. Everyone is scared of the socialization. But what we've realized is that, socialization looks different sometimes in homeschoolers and unschoolers. And especially when they're not in the same age or grade class every single day for every day of their 12 years of K through 12, right? Instead, there's a lot of age mixing going on. So unschooled and homeschooled and democratic schooled students might have friends of all ages. Mm-hmm. And although the outside world might see that as different, right? It's probably healthier socialization than we have in school. We will never be in the same place as 30 other same grade, same age people in our whole entire lives. So, homeschooler and unschooler socialization as adults, as adults look just pretty similar than they do as kids. So those are the ones that most come up, and those are the ones that are most reported. Out of those 75 unschooled adults that Peter Gray and I interviewed, I think there was 3 that did not have a great experience. And I think it's important to talk about it, right? Like, I think it's important. Everyone's like, well, we'll just put those 3 aside. But I always think it's important to talk about the 3 because they all had higher degrees. And they also all had families who were either dealing with mental illness or highly religious. And so they had less autonomy and were more structured. So it was just interesting to look at those stories as well as the 72 out of 75 that had, fantastic experiences.
Yeah. And that's why I'm including this question in this conversation. This is absolutely worth exploring. I think to the learning gap piece, one of the things that comes up for me is that I don't know everything about everything, right? And teaching is not the same as learning. They taught me lots of things that I didn't necessarily learn. And, the people who are on top get to decide what is taught, so there's I grew up knowing almost nothing about Black history or the role of Black people in our country, except Martin Luther King Jr. And that was it. So, lots of all kinds of gaps. And one strength that I find that my kids had being raised as unschoolers that I did not have was this very learn. So we talk about instead of teaching our kids what to learn, we teach them how to learn, and then they can learn whatever they want. So whenever they come up to a gap, it's oh, here's this thing I don't know. So I want to know more about it. And then they do. And if they need support with that, they come and they ask for support with that. Or if I notice they're reaching for something, I can say, hey, it seems like you want to know more about that. Do you want me to offer some resources where you can learn more about that? So I think there's not for people like me who were raised in the traditional schooling system, if there is a gap in my knowledge, I always sort of at first, it feels like I've hit a wall where it's oh, I wasn't that wasn't poured into me. So I just that's it. Learning's done, school's over. Even though obviously that's not how I live my life. And still my inner child is oh, nope, a teacher can't teach that to you. It's too late. So you can never learn it. And really that's not how learning works.
No. And one of you hit it right on the head, right? One of the greatest strengths of unschooling and unschoolers is that they know how to learn. And so when confronted with something either challenging or something that they have to do to get something else, right? They will know how to do that. They will know how to get the resources and they will just do it, right? The learning is very natural and the assessment is very self-assessment based instead of someone else assessing them.
Yeah. And there's no time limit on this stuff. If, learning, I don't know, calculus is not your kid's jam when they're 10. And then when they're 20, there's some cool thing that they want to participate in. Like they can learn it when they're 20. Like, so there's no like expiration date there as to when you can learn things, which, is helpful for me to remember. And of course, now that my kids are older and I've seen it in action, it's a lot easier for me to have confidence and trust in that. Cause like I witnessed them doing that with things. The socialization piece, I definitely want to touch on because first of all, like completely agree with everything you said. And that mixed age play is like actually a tremendous strength that I see my kids having now. Cause right now, like my oldest, so this last year, my two oldest were both connected with the high school and involved with the high school. And the other families thought it was so odd that they, like, A, they're best friends with each other, but B, they have friends of all different ages. So everyone else, at the high school was like, okay, the ninth graders hang out with the ninth graders and the 12th graders hang out with the 12th graders. And my kids were like shaking that all up and they're having all the kids come to all the things and they're bringing the teachers snacks and talking to the grownups and telling them what's going on. And the kids are like, what in the world?
Yeah. Yes.
Huge advantage for them. Like they had all the friends to choose from. They didn't have like this notion that, you have to stay in your lane. Like, no, we can connect and have fun with all the different people.
Everyone. I remember a physician thinking it was so odd that my son's best friend was our neighbor, and our neighbor was like 53, right? We would teach him about cars and all of this fun stuff, and and it was just so odd to that physician. And I still think about that. And right now my son is 27 and our neighbor is in his 70s, and they are still so connected. And it's such a sweet friendship, but it's also, it's really tells a lot, right? He's watched my son learn and mature, and my son has watched him mature into old age, and that sort of cross-generational learning, that cultural transmission is really important.
Oh, I love that. Okay. So, and I think too, with that socialization piece, you're right that, how I kind of sort of conceptualize the disadvantage to this is that because the majority of children are in schools, that means they're sort of locked away in these buildings and not accessible to a lot of homeschoolers or unschoolers, during school hours during the day. So there definitely is a difference in what I have observed between the level of friendship that my kids are able to have when they're showing up in a place with the same group of kids over and over and over and over. So like my kids got a lot of that from like the sailing program that they were in, where they were there a lot and we did it, we're a lot super involved. So they're with that same group of kids. Whereas when they're not in an activity that has that level of commitment, it is harder to sort of like deepen those bonds, or it takes a lot longer. So like we have some friends who we've been friends with for many, many years, and they can get at that level of like friendship intimacy, but it is harder. And I think a big part of that is simply because most of the kids are in school. So it's like they have their friends and they're not accessible a lot of the time.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of, if you think about it, right, it mimics adult friendship a lot. So like the homeschooler and unschooler socialization mimics adult friendships. We tend to spend a lot of time, if we're in a workplace, with the people we work with. Yeah. And those are our colleagues. And so when, kids are in school, those are their colleagues. And when our homeschoolers and unschoolers are at a class or at a nature group, those are their colleagues, right? And so after school, that space, it's maybe harder to connect, but there's still a connection there. So again, I think the socialization aspect sort of maybe mirrors more what college students and adults feel instead of mimics what like the kids in school feel, right? Like you're just connected to your community, whatever that looks like. And that might look different in every sort of social situation or in every sort of community situation.
Yeah, for sure. And it's nice to not have all the negative side of that like forced association.
And nothing wrong, right? Like there's nothing wrong with being connected to your community, right? This is something that we foster all the time in school kids. You definitely see less bullying, and we know that, in homeschooled or unschooled environments. And it's not because they're not exposed to it, because they certainly are exposed to it, but it's definitely more of, it happens in community. So it's much different. It's very interesting. And one of the questions that I get most, right? Like, what about the socialization piece? And it's just we can talk about it. We could talk about age mixing, and we could talk about being connected to community. But to me, of all the things that we worry about, that's not something we should worry about, right? Like it doesn't even enter the brain, but it enters everyone else's.
I think right now, a lot of what I've seen that's sort of very like current is that, so for example, for my kids, like we're in COVID and there's, all of the isolation of COVID and coming out of COVID, like the homeschooling programs were still shut down and not allowed to be open, and the schools were. So that was a big, like my kids were like, we want to jump in that puddle because we want to be with other humans. And that's the only place they are allowed to be. I'm like, I totally hear you. That's valid.
Yeah, that makes sense. Right. And again, it's more about, I never see it as like a versus, right? So I never see it as like school versus, right? It's different environments, different communities.
Yeah. And I think as unschoolers, like our kids, we can recognize that there are all these resources, and we can use them as they feel advantageous to us and not use them when they don't. And that's like, nothing needs to be off the table. We can be open to all of it. So the last thing I wanted to touch on, which one of the things you mentioned was about the criticism that comes from the outside. And it reminded me of, like, in the transgender community, a lot of the research that comes out of there shows that, like, if you accept and support trans kids, for example, their outcomes are exactly the same as cisgender kids. So like when you're in this, like a population that's sort of a bit of like a lightning rod for negativity, or is associated with like lack of acceptance and criticism, that makes things harder, unsurprisingly, right?
Unsurprisingly, it's very interesting. You hear a lot of homeschoolers and unschoolers say, I know what it's like to be part of an out group, right?
Yeah.
I know what it's like to be an outsider or someone who's not accepted, because I've felt it. It gives you great empathy, but you also know that, criticism hurts, and criticism is also very long lasting. And so I think we just need to be careful of that just generally, right? We should be accepting of all schooling options. And I think we are. Post-COVID, I think this is going to change, right? Because more people have heard about unschooling, more people have heard about homeschooling. And so I think people are more accepting when they hear you homeschool, because they know what that kind of looks like, even though what we did during COVID was an emergency homeschooling or unschooling. But pre-COVID, that was a big, big concern.
Yeah. And it was exhausting.
Yeah.
Like that's the word that I think of the most, like just from my experience, especially when the kids are younger and I'm sort of the buffer, like trying to, protect them to a certain extent from a lot of that criticism. Like it's just exhausting. It's like this whole other like mental load, relational load that I have to carry, that most people who are choosing just like sort of the mainstream way don't have that added weight.
Exactly.
Okay. And then just lastly on the disadvantages, I want to touch on the potential for abuse. I feel like that's come up a lot in conversation recently. And so I just sort of wanted to hear your take on it. Like, we know, like, children who are in school are also suffering abuse at home. Like, homeschooling doesn't inoculate us from that, but it also, it's sort of there's a risk in any educational model you choose. There's nothing that we can do to ensure that never happens ever anywhere. So if you could sort of speak to that risk.
Sure. So that came up in that Harvard study. And it's so interesting because the woman who had studied at Harvard, she doesn't have a history of homeschooling or unschooling research. I'm not sure where that came up. That being said, if you look at percentages, right, there is no difference, right? Like kids can be abused in any sort of environment. It is not the homeschooling environment that hides abuse better. Schooled environments are pretty good at hiding abuse. And so, for me, it's not something I particularly study. It's not something I particularly at all am concerned about. I think if someone actually did a study, the levels would be very, very similar, right? If not, kids in school encounter physical, emotional, sexual abuse as much as any other child, including homeschooling and unschooling. I think homeschooling abuse cases get a lot of press and media, again, because whenever people are doing something different, there's a lot of questioning and a lot of curiosity. I know that there's that new docu-series about Shiny Happy People about the Duggars, right? But the Duggars are not the only homeschooling family that has ever existed on this earth, right? And so part of that is about thinking about religion and how that plays into play, or thinking about any sort of insular environment. We're really just talking about, right, insular environments. And so I'm personally not an expert in this, but I am not alarmed, and I am not like, this is a great way to hide abuse, because again, like, homeschoolers and unschoolers get as much as, if not more, scrutiny than kids in school. So it's not something that I am particularly concerned about, but it's also not something that I particularly study.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think like the bottom line is like abuse does happen in homeschooling and unschooling families, and it happens in schooled families, and it happens in it's tragic
families.
Yeah.
And it's horrible and tragic when it occurs. And my heart goes out to any abuse survivor of any sort. But it is not isolated to homeschooling or unschooling.
And it happens in organizations and in schools and religious organizations and, across the spectrum. So I think like, absolutely, we can continue to be open to like what the research tells us about that and how we can better support kids who are in those positions, and like saying, homeschooling is like, let's ban homeschooling. Like it's not going to solve the problem. So,
and one doesn't have to do with another, right?
Yeah.
Although I think it's always good for schools and free schools and democratic schools to look at their policies, right? Surrounding teachers and fingerprinting and all of that, right? I'm always for keeping kids safe, right? And that's period. And hope, and I know all of us are.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about higher education. So how are unschoolers able to access higher education? Because I know that's a fear for a lot of people. Like, how will your kid ever go to college? So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's so funny. When we were writing that article, Peter Gray and I always wanted to call that article like, the kids are all right? Like everyone is okay. And there are many different ways to access higher education. I work in higher education, and I get calls all the time from Ivy League schools that are like, how do I, get in touch with more homeschoolers and unschoolers who are more self-directed? Most people are seeing this as an advantage to getting into college rather than a disadvantage. That being said, they sometimes don't go to college in the traditional way that you would see, or get accepted to college in the traditional way that you would see a schooled kid get into college, right? There are many ways, there are many paths to college. So like your traditional K-12 school kid, they have transcripts, they have their SATs or their ACTs, they write an essay, things like that. If you look at pretty much every single school's application portal, they will always have, it'll say for homeschooled students, right? It'll say it right there. And this is what you need. It might be that the parent, sends their homeschooling records that they've sent to the state, or their transcript, or that the parent create a transcript. It might be that the school prefers a portfolio of work the student has done. It may be that the school prefers an interview and a resume. It may be that the school prefers an audition. I mean, there are so many different ways to get into college. A lot of students who are homeschooled or unschooled use community college as a stepping stone. That way they get the community college transcript and then they go on to a 4-year college. Some students do the traditional GRE route, although less and less students are doing so because, again, most admissions offices have like, for homeschooled students, this is what we need. Some students choose to take standardized tests. As you can see from the general higher ed environment, that is getting less and less prevalent. What colleges are wanting are those intrinsically motivated, self-directed students. And so I think it's really informative to talk to admissions officers, to talk to program directors, to see what they are looking for in a homeschooled student if that information is not available on the website. But there are many different ways to college, and sometimes it never has to do with the traditional way.
Yeah. So my oldest, we just had graduation a few days ago. So she graduated with her associate degree and her high school diploma through the Running Start program here in the state of Washington. So she was always unschooled. And then when she was at the start of her junior year, Washington State pays for your kid, if you want to go to community college for 2 years. And then at the end of that, you walk away with the associate degree and the high school diploma. And she got accepted to her university of choice for her bachelor's degree. And all I had to do was just create a little transcript for 9th and 10th grade. And that was like, that was it. Like, it took me an hour to do it. And then now she's off in the fall to her university of choice. So for my family, it was really a very easy path for my kid. And she's super, super happy with where she is based on her goals and what she wants to do and how she's going to get there. She doesn't experience any of it as having been a limitation. And if anything, it gives her a really interesting story to tell that sets her apart from other people. And so really she sees it as having been an advantage.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think I always say, you should write. I always tell my son, you should write a handbook on how to get into college, right? Again, people have different stories, right? My son went and talked to the program director, did an interview and an audition because he was majoring in classical guitar for his undergrad. And so that's how he got into college, right? It was basically talk to the program director, interview, audition. And I think they looked at transcripts that we self-made. He went on to graduate school. And of course, once you have those college credits, right? No one cares. It's they just need that, whether it's a community college transcript. My son went to Berklee School of Music and did an online certificate program, right? So once they had that, it all became, okay, you can succeed in a higher ed environment. So we're not really particularly worried about you.
Yes.
He went on to get his master's, right? And now he's an editor at a major publishing company in New York and lives a very, very normal life, right? Almost too normal, right?
Be radical, man.
I know, right? Whatever happened to that? But, he majored in classical guitar and his master's was in music theory, but then he really decided he wanted a regular 9 to 5. So now he is an editor that runs medical journals, right? So for a major publishing company. So, the paths, just like all of our paths, again, whether schooled or unschooled, right? Your path is not always linear. And the whole point of college and graduate school is really to explore different areas that you are interested in and that you enjoy.
Yes. So I have a funny story. When we were getting ready for my kids' graduation ceremony, my dad was hanging out with my husband, and my husband asked my dad something about oh, do you remember your, high school graduation? He was like, oh, I never graduated from high school, but my dad has a master's degree, and has lived a very successful life. My husband was like, wait, what?
Where's that secret? Yeah.
And he was like, it was never relevant. No one ever asked for it. I just
No, yeah. I mean, it's that kind of conversation, right? And it does come up and it does make you unique when you have it. But I think my son had said the other day, like, he's like, I don't think anyone knows I was like homeschooled or unschooled, right? It just seems like a very non-issue and I'm not going to bring it up. So,
Yeah. And then on reflecting, I was like, I mean, yeah, no one's ever asked for like my high school diploma. I mean, like maybe like just through the initial application process to college, but then again, there's just a different path if you're applying as a homeschooler or as a homeschooler, you know, your parent can give you a high school diploma and you just send them that. Like, it's not even that complex.
yeah, no, I think I'll worry about it and make it like a bigger issue than it actually is.
Agreed.
There are many, many ways to get into college.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, what kind of careers are grown unschoolers engaging in?
Every single kind, right? Like it's the same as schooled kids, right?
Yeah.
But what we did see in our grown unschooling study is we saw a lot of entrepreneurs, right? And no surprise, unschoolers
Self-direction.
really, right? Self-direction, do what you love, intrinsic motivation. They're really good at managing their own time. They don't really need a boss to manage it for them. So we did see a lot of entrepreneurs. We saw a lot of individuals in STEM-based fields. And that science, technology, engineering, and math, right? Which was a surprise, right? Because everyone's like, oh, how do homeschoolers learn math? But we saw a lot of people in STEM-based fields because of the exploration that's really inherent in unschooling and homeschooling. You spend your days pretty much exploring, whether, you know, it's exploring something you love. A lot of kids love video games. We saw a lot of video game designers, right? Again, they had all different paths, but heavy on entrepreneurship, heavy on STEM. And most went to college and were highly successful in college and saw college as very similar to what they experienced as teenagers, homeschooling and unschooling, right? You choose your own classes, you choose based on your interests and based on what might be an optimal challenge for you. So yeah, the kids are all right. They're okay. They're also, interestingly, very economically aware. I thought that was really interesting, but makes total sense. When you're in school, you are kind of shielded from the adult world, right? From the world where parents live in. You don't watch people paying bills. You don't watch the everyday workings of running a household. When you're homeschooled or unschooled, that is a real advantage. You are watching every day, right? Your family run a household, and that includes management of money. So we did see a lot of like frugal individuals, people who are really like economically aware, people who we asked the question, like, are you in debt or something? Or are you financially independent was the question we asked. And the majority were financially independent. And like, when I'm reading this, I'm like, oh my gosh, as someone who's still like paying off their student loans as a full-grown adult, right? I have a lot to learn from these people.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I love that point because I talk a lot about personal finance. It's like one of my little passions over here. And I completely agree because as unschoolers, it's like my kids get a seat at the table. They're present for these conversations. They're not only witnessing, but participating in the conversation when we're choosing what we want to say yes to. And you can't say yes to everything. And how do we make those choices? And so I love that point. I find that so fascinating. And I'll say too, when you mentioned like that a lot of unschoolers find college to be very similar. So my oldest, like I said, when she started her junior year, she started at the community college and that felt very seamless to her. Like she was like treated the same way that she's treated at home. And then for this school year, she wanted to take like fun classes at the high school so she could have that like high school experience. And she was like horrified by the way like the adults treated the kids and the limitations of freedoms and the utter lack of like self-direction. Like there's no space for that. And I think that was more like jarring to her than, the college buzz, which felt very seamless.
Imagine. Yeah. And I mean, and that report is like what you hear all the time. Like college felt very comfortable.
Yeah.
While still learning about the environment, because anytime you're in a new environment, you still have to learn about it. But yeah, any sort of high school environment does feel different, totally different.
Yes.
It's fine. It's something to explore, right?
Okay, so share with us a little bit more about your own family's experience with your son growing up unschooled. I know you talked a little bit about how we went into college, but I also know, like, so you're a professor, you're teaching teachers how to teach, and then you have your own child. And how do you end up living this sort of dichotomous existence?
No, uh, no. So my son, I was a single mom. I was a teen mom. And so I had my son very young. He did a lot of school with me. So he went to my college classes. He went to a lot of undergrad classes. He went to a lot of grad classes. I was going to school, taking care of my son and working at the same time. I got involved in online education very early on, like 27 years ago, because it was the only way that I could, right, like make money and also be with my son. And because I had that school aspect, I didn't want to be away for all of the day, right? I wanted to do something where I could do it with him or with him there. So I spent a large majority of his early childhood, again, in schools, and he was coming along with me for the ride. And then when I went to get my master's and doctorate, I started teaching in higher ed, both in person and online. And so he witnessed that progression as well. And I would take jobs that I had to take, right? So I had taken a job as a professor of special education because of my background in psychology. Not that I knew the field of special education so well. I ended up loving that. That is my passion. It's what I do all the time now, right? And so I ended up taking job teaching teachers and being a supervisor for teachers in public schools. I don't talk to my students about unschooling or homeschooling, really. The only time they really know is if they look me up. And sometimes they get like the closed doors and the whispers and like the confessions. I homeschool my own kid. But I live a dichotomy, but I also think the two fields can learn so much from each other. I have always thought that. Unschoolers have that freedom. They have that autonomy. They have that intrinsic motivation that's facilitated towards sort of naturally. And so how can we bring that in a more public school environment? I know that my choice to unschool was my personal choice. I was not in a family dynamic where I could do that, really, right? How many single mothers did you hear in 1998 who were unschooling their kids, right?
Yeah.
But I had made choices just based on the fact that every year was a new year. I would ask my son every year, you want to go to school this year? And, it would sometimes be a let's explore. And we did. And he ended up unschooling and choosing that. So every year I didn't expect to unschool till college. It kind of just happened. And I'm so glad it did. It's actually the best thing I will ever do. And of course, my son is the best thing I will ever create in my whole life. He's an amazing human being. But again, I don't see the two as dichotomous fields. And I'm always talking about how we can learn from each other. I love my New York City school teachers. I want to teach them what serves them in the classroom. I don't need to teach them about unschooling. I do need to teach them about intrinsic motivation because I think that's something that they can take with them into the classroom, right? But my two lives, they are separate but apart, but they always inform one another.
Oh, I love that. And you are such an inspiration. I mean, there are so many people out there when they first hear about unschooling, even who wonder, like, is this possible for me? How can I bring these different parts of me and integrate them together? And can I make all of the logistics of this work? So even just you sort of living out loud and, being a visible person in the space is inspiring. And then, of course, the way you talk about it and the work that you do helps us even more. So thank you tremendously for all that you do. Now, you said that the special education piece is a real passion for you. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Like, say, you're talking to some unschooling families out there who have children with different disabilities, neurodiversities, whatever label resonates with them. What could you say to them that you think would be helpful to hear?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm also super excited. So my new research focuses on unschooling students with disabilities and will be published later this month in the Journal of Unschooling and Alternative Learning. And I was scared to do this study because you're always, as a researcher, right? Like you see the connection, but then you're like super scared because you're like, what if this doesn't work? And then like what you've imagined in your head is not what actually happens.
Yes.
So I'm always scared. And I really do. Like, I come with a non-biased researcher hat on. I am a teacher educator, right?
Way to be brave.
Yeah, like really. And I was really happy to know that there are so many amazing parents with kids with all types of /ability, with kids with neurodiversity, with kids with more physical disabilities, with kids with Down syndrome, with kids with severe and multiple disabilities, who saw unschooling as a really healing space, somewhere where their child did have bodily autonomy, which is especially important for kids with disabilities, somewhere where kids could really learn what they wanted to learn, when they wanted to learn, when their health allowed. And so unschooling itself came into play as this super healing, super productive space where kids really could get their individualized educational needs met. And for me, that's most important, right? In public schools, you have individualized education plans. How are these kids getting their academic, social, and emotional needs met? And unschoolers were doing it just beautifully. I think the challenges are challenges we hear all the time. It was definitely the criticism part. They are doing something very different, right? It's one thing to unschool your neurotypical kid, and it's another thing to unschool a student with a disability. They also called and were really advocates for having more unschooling / disability friendly practitioners. And I think that's a really important point, right? To have tutors and to have occupational therapists and physical therapists and psychologists and everyone you need who would be comfortable with and knew about unschooling and homeschooling. I thought that was so interesting and so needed. And there was also need for these families to have respite. A lot of times for families of students with disabilities, school becomes a respite place because your child is outside of the home for a certain number of hours per day. But unschooling families really needed other families to understand that they needed respite as well. And they also called for the unschooling community to be more open to students with disabilities within their groups, right? So it might not look like, right, like to have more inclusive unschooling and homeschooling groups.
Yes.
So, I learned so much from that study. Overall, personally, professionally, and I'm so excited to talk about it. I'll be talking about it at AERO, the Alternative Education Resource Organization conference this weekend. But most of my conference talks now this year will be focused on that because I just thought, wow, it's really, really big.
That is really, really big. And I love that last point you made too about how for the people listening saying, okay, what can we do to help? Like, what can we do to support? Making space for these kids and these families in your existing spaces is a big thing you can do. I have a homeschool adventure club that I always used to run. And I have a course to help people set that up. And one of the things I talk about in there is that this is an inclusive space. Like if you're trying to tap into my model, this is an inclusive space. And this is what that can look like. And there are some, growing pains and, discomforts that can show up. And here's how you can work through them, because I feel like this is so important that we need to be inclusive of all of the children and all of the different ways of being. And our kids benefit from that connection just as much as these other kids do. So I love that you're bringing that point up. It's something that I don't hear talked a lot about, and it's worth it to make space for these families in our existing communities.
Yeah, and thank you for doing so, because that's a really, really big thing.
Yeah. Okay, the show notes can be found at sagefamily.com/podcast89, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. What, Gina, are your favorite resources for people to dive deeper into this topic?
Oh, okay. So I have a ton of them. I'm always going to recommend my colleague Peter Gray and Free to Learn, both the blog, the Substack, and the book.
And I'll link to our episode with him too. It was one of my favorites.
Yes, amazing. Oh gosh, I want to link to everybody I know. So I have written the Homeschooling Starter Guide, and I actually think if you're a homeschooling family or unschooling family thinking about this form of education, I actually think it's a great little guide. It's $10, and I think it's $99 on Kindle. 99 cents, sorry, on Kindle. So I always think that that's a fantastic resource. I wrote an academic book called Unschooling: Exploring Learning Beyond the Classroom, published by Palgrave Macmillan. If you're interested in the science behind unschooling, I think it's a great, great book.
I've read that one. It was a great, great book for all, like I have so many like of my fellow like nerdy parents who like really want to dig into all of that. Like that is the book for you. I loved it.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for saying it. So I hope a second edition comes soon. And I think, there's so many amazing podcasts. Your podcast is an incredible resource. I love Robin Robertson's podcast. There are just so many amazing people within this space. So utilize all of it, right? And people can always reach out to me if there are any questions. I think I'm Professor G. Riley on Twitter. I'm the Unschooled Professor on Instagram. I don't do a lot of like social media. It's just like fun for me. So, you can always email me directly. I'm always happy to respond, and I'm always happy also to send resources.
Yes. So we will link to Gina's website. We will link to Gina on Instagram and her Twitter, like she mentioned. I'm also going to link to her research page, and then all of these books and people that you've mentioned. So Gina, thank you so much for giving us some of your time. I am just personally and selfishly so excited that I got to chat with you because you're one of those people. I just feel like you were my friend before I even met you.
I feel the same way. Thank you so much for the invitation. Again, so much love and success to you.